seen the worst, and there is nothing left for me to hate, so I can lay me down, my brothers, on the ground. I bled today until Coyote comes to raise me up and carries me
Hello, everybody. Excuse me. I'll try that again. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Scottish Rugby Podcast, brought to you by the Scottish Rugby Blog. I am Cammy Black. Joining me this evening, who turns up on time, all present and correct. It's Mr. John Anderson here, 10 minutes before, always waiting for me in the green room. Let's call it the green room. John,
yeah, green room.
How are the snacks?
They were good. There was pink wafers tonight. It was really tasty. I had a nice Assam tea, which was lovely.
A couple of Russian Twitter sex bots as well. They were there.
All good times. All good times.
And then joining us live, literally seconds from devouring what I understand was some pretty tasty ribs. It's Ian Hay.
Hello. Yes, they were tasty. They were a wee bit bony, a bit lacking in meat, but they were good, as ribs always are. Ribs is
Are
good
you late?
food.
Are you late because you had to spend all that time cleaning up?
He's
frozen. It's the ribs that have done that.
Is it back now?
It's back now, yeah. I think you froze because of it. I'm assuming it's got some rib sauce on the camera or something.
No, I think it's because I've got 800 million tabs open, so if my computer was to slow down to alt,
that's fine.
Shut stuff down.
Well, professional as we are, here we are anyway for the podcast. Now, as some of you may have noticed, this is part 2 of our podcast this week. Part 1, Ian interviewed Dan Leo. Our initial plan was we were going to kind of feature that interview as part of tonight's podcast, but Dan was really kind and generous with his time, and Ian and Dan ended up talking for almost an hour about some of the issues that come up in the Oceans Apart film. So what we thought we'd do, we put that out as a separate podcast. Go away and listen to that now. If you're watching this live, don't go away now because we would rather you watch this. But do catch up on that. It's a very, very well worth listening to. What we're going to do is we're going to chat about the film in this podcast, and we've all watched it. It's on Amazon Prime. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's called Oceans Apart. Lots of people talking about it on Facebook and on Twitter. We would have normally covered the Fiji game. Obviously, that was cancelled because of coronavirus. Although it looks like Fiji might actually get a game this weekend or next weekend. I think it would be next week. This weekend, wouldn't it, against Georgia at Murrayfield. That's possibly going ahead. So we will do that. We're going to talk about Oceans Apart. We're going to have a little preview of the Ireland match. Although as we record this, it's Wednesday evening and there's no Scotland team being announced. So we'll not get too much into that because by the time people listen to this, they'll probably have the team out, and anything we say will be massively out of date when they select Scotland selects some random 15-year-old at fullback who's been cited in the background of pictures of Scotland training, who we think we've identified. More on that later. So if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter at Cammy Black or at Scott Rugby Blog. You can visit the blog scottishrugbyblog.co.uk and get involved in the comments on the articles. You can watch us on YouTube, Twitch, and anywhere, and you can download our podcast from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Acast. If you are listening to us on Apple Podcast, can I ask you, please, if you've got 2 minutes, please leave us a review. We haven't had one for a while, so some of those reviews are a little bit out of date. We also, because as many of our loyal listeners will know, we are one of the wokest rugby podcasts. I think not the wokest, probably up there with one of the wokest podcasts. Unfortunately, that has attracted some negative comments from people who are, what's the opposite of woke? Would you be a slumber? Sleep? Yeah, people who are not woke, people who are asleep to the issues of the day, and they've left some rather harsh reviews, unfair reviews. So if you could redress the balance, that'd be much appreciated. I'm not in my uniform tonight. John and Ian are on brand. We are also, as we have been throughout this, we are brought to you in partnership with Manscaped.com. If you go to manscaped.com and enter the code SRP, you will get 20% off your product and free shipping. Now, manscaped.com, for any of you not listening to the podcast, they produce male grooming tools. So they've sent us a pack. We've got some ball toner. We've got some downstairs deodorant. We've got some clippers. A number of you, we understand, have ordered those, so hopefully you're enjoying those in the comfort of your home. Now, this week they've sent us something as a little treat for how well things are going and see us through December. We've got this. It's called, I'm going to get this right. It's called the Weed Whacker. It's a nose hair trimmer. They're American, but it's a little nose hair trimmer. Now, it's the one bit of kit that I would actually use. We've established I am not a manscaper, but it's a nifty little nose hair trimmer. So if you're interested in that, it's Christmas is coming. If you've got anybody that you know that could do with a little trim in the nose, or I haven't tried it in the ears. I did find a long hair. I did find a long hair in the ear the other day. That was really upsetting. So I'm nearly 40.
I've managed to avoid ear hair so far.
Yeah.
How?
I have no idea.
Like,
seeing as the rest of me is covered in hair.
Exactly. It'll come as no surprise to many of our fans that, given that we are two heads of the same gigantor beast, we both share a certain hirsute nature. I thought that was a nose trimmer.
Ian was vaping with the nose hair trimmer.
Modified it. There we go.
It does come with a USB power cable.
It does, which is really handy because normally with these kind of things, you're either searching around for batteries, which my old nose hair trimmer used to do. I'd have to try and find the batteries, like nicking them out of the remote controls before I had to go and trim it, or you're searching for a bathroom plug.
Have you ever had a situation where your trimmer, and I'm not going to specify which trimmer, has run out of batteries mid-trim and has caught a hair and has got stuck on said hair and is a bit uncomfortable?
I haven't had that. I have had it cut out on me kind of mid-shave when I've had important meetings to go to, and like I've been left with that ridiculous kind of, you're doing the pattern and you're having a wee bit of a laugh. I think there's a sketch on BBC Scotland where somebody does this thing and ends up with a wee Hitler moustache, and then his trimmer runs out on his wedding morning. We've all been there. They end up having to try and dig around for a blunt bic to try and get rid of the
single blader
in the morning. I know. So yeah, I've been there, done that. But yeah, so manscaped.com for the, Christmas is coming.
Just a little tip: if you are using it for what they suggest, be very careful, because John Anderson myself earlier.
Yes.
I'd recommend using a guard, and just watch when you get to the seam, shall we say.
They are waterproof. You can use them in the shower. I understand from reading that does make things softer. Did you?
Yeah.
Well,
yes. Needed a wee short back in science this morning.
We can say that the products themselves are high quality. We can't say the same for the users of those products.
No. The issue with these lie often between the computer screen right now and the chair.
Yeah. So that's, go to manscaped.com, enter the code SRP, and you'll get 20% off any of the products that are on their website, plus free shipping as well. Let's get on and talk about some rugby. Daft Craigie, hello, is on Twitch with us. He suggested that the opposite of woke is simply a racist. Now, he then goes on to say, the opposite of woke, not used. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for the clarification.
Pop up and I thought, wow, that's Like, I applaud. That's very direct.
Yeah. So we'll just get into this. We've got Andy Lone has said it. Great. Hello, Andy, regular live listener. Andy joins us most Tuesday or Wednesday evenings. There's a great piece on Oceans Apart. Really enjoyed listening to it. Ian, you did the interview with Dan. He didn't really pull any punches, but I thought what really came across was kind of how measured he was with everything that he said. And, there's a lot of, you could hear the anger, but also it was he put his points across very calmly, very measured. And, he's not they're not going away, are they? Pacific Rugby Welfare and Dan Leo are not going away anytime soon.
No, I think not particularly off the back of the documentary, which is seems to be gaining quite a lot of popularity / notoriety. And yeah, like you said, man, sometimes if you were to maybe just read one of Dan's tweets, it might sound a bit sort of angry and firebrandy, but he is very measured, very calm. He had a big thick book of notes with him, and he makes these points very concisely and clearly and crisply, and you could argue with them, but you'd have to have really strong arguments. Yeah,
and we'll go through some of the points tonight. The other interesting thing I think was that his view and his perception of how things are in the Pacific Islands have changed over the years as well as he's gone about in his research things. So I think he says in the documentary, and he said in the interview with you that how he felt in 2011 when effectively he was dropped from Samoa for effectively questioning the way that things were being run in the Samoa Rugby Union. His views on the reasons behind that have changed. I think he kind of initially felt it was just all corrupt and it was all World Rugby's fault. I think the view he reaches now is probably a lot more nuanced.
Yeah, it was actually 2014 was when he was canned. Yeah, although he does say when he goes to visit the president of Samoa, who is also the chairman of the Samoan Rugby Union, when he leaves, he does sort of say maybe I've fallen for these sort of charisma. But
yeah, I mean, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, there's three kind of points we can look at. I mean, the first thing to look at is probably I've got governance, finance, and eligibility. Does that sound three fair points to cover that come up in the documentary?
It does, but I apologise to watching this, but I've got a bit of red meat stuck in my teeth and it's doing my mouth.
Right, I'm going to mute. I will mute Ian. In fact, this is a good chance.
I'll stop my camera and I'll just pick away. That issue.
He's off. Anyway, the interesting thing, John, I think, is that last week there was an article went on Rugby Pass. Now, Rugby Pass normally a very reputable site. It's really good, excellent writing on there. You've got Jamie Lyle regularly writing about Scottish rugby on there. Really good, interesting articles. There was what I'd probably call a bit of a hack piece, I think, looking at the documentary, which kind of questioned the reasons why people were up in arms about what was being said in it. And there was talk about it being white saviors coming to the rescue of Pacific Islanders, and if they're going away to economically better themselves, then that's just capitalism, and we should all we should all just let them get on with it. But the reality of that is much different.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think to make that statement is very immature. It doesn't take into account a lot of there's many different layers to the. I'm going to mix my metaphors here, but there's many different layers to the picture that is coming out here, and I think it's interesting. It's interesting to hear people in privileged positions of being able to freely talk about their sport they love for economic gain, whilst living a very comfortable life in a very comfortable country, criticising people, saying, if you choose to come and economically better yourself, that's your bag, and suck it up, big boy. It's it's much more complex than that. And I have to say, I hadn't kind of really appreciated the political
side of things on the islands. I knew, particularly with Fiji, I think more recently, I kind of was much more aware of it with what happened with Francis Keane, which we'll get on to in a minute. But I'm going to play a clip from the interview for those of you who haven't seen it. And this is Dan. Ian opens with a question, and this is Dan Leo kind of talking about the solutions he sees to the way that rugby's run on the islands.
Obviously, there has been sort of issues internally. So, obviously yourself, when you raised the issues about this Samoan corruption, Fiji, interesting story there, what with Francis Keane and Frank Bainimarama. So how would you sort of advocate World Rugby, or is there a way that you see World Rugby being able to prevent people who aren't fit and proper persons, or who don't certainly seem to be fit and proper persons, interfering in the domestic rugby unions there?
Yeah, I believe, since making the film, and I've had a while to reflect on this, there needs to be a law like most other major sports have got, that disallows people in public office to hold positions of power in rugby union as well. There's just too much of a conflict there. There's always going to be question marks around their motives. For me, there needs to be a distance between politicians and the game of rugby, particularly in the islands, where it's seen as a way that to win votes. It's hearts and minds at the end of the day. If you control rugby, you control the hearts and minds of the people, and that's why they're so close. There might not necessarily even be any financial gain to be made, but it's the way that our Prime Minister, people know Samoa for rugby. It's what's put us on the map, and he wants to be seen as the guy at the top of that. But yeah, it's got to change. For me, again, it comes back to the governing body, looking at other sports. I know FIFA, for instance, don't allow politicians to be involved with the administration of the game, and if they do, there's financial penalties. They penalise. They can stop them from partaking in tournaments, etc., etc. But for that to happen, there needs to be a way also for us to be able to make money and become profitable. And the reason, again, we look at the film is one of the reasons why our unions are so reliant on the politicians is that we just don't have we don't have enough games to be able to get proper sponsorship. When we do get fixtures against England or Wales or Scotland, for instance, usually we know about 3 months in advance. Well, sponsorship, a run into getting decent sponsorship is, probably we would need to know 2 years in advance. So there's a lot of issues there. And then, the fact that there's to put it frankly, that we can't, and one of the CEOs of Samoa Rugby said it to me. Without politics, there's no rugby. There's no rugby in the Pacific without the politicians funding it, and that needs to change equally as much as getting rid of the politicians. In my mind, it's got to be two-pronged. Because as long as we're reliant on government funding and public funding for our unions, in the absence of a fair financial share elsewhere, the politicians are always going to expect to be involved.
I think that was the kind of thing that came away from the documentary. For me, is that line that said, without politics in the Pacific Islands, there's no rugby, Ian. I mean, that's kind of frightening, really. And I suppose it's a bit chicken and egg, like Dan was saying there, is, what comes first? Do you sort that out and kind of bar people in political office from controlling rugby? Or do you need to give the unions a fairer share of, more access to earning money so that they don't have to rely on politicians? And it's almost an impossible puzzle to solve, really.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, it seems like the way to fix it would be to make sure that there's enough money going back there so that people who are rugby people are able to go back there and deal with it themselves. But like Dan said, it's a bit of a popularity contest, which is why the Prime Minister, I can't remember if it's the Prime Minister, President of Samoa,
President, I think, Samoa President. He's also president there.
And I'm never going to try and pronounce it because it's very, very difficult. I don't even think Dan, in Notions Apart, Dan doesn't even try and pronounce it. So there, it is a sort of catch-22 situation. But that's why, he's, he always says, this is why we need to get the right people around the table about it. If, you think if there was a way that they could cooperatively work with those politicians who are involved, that would be the best solution for everyone. One of the things that would concern me is, if, like Keith was saying there, if FIFA have rules and Fiji were banned from the Commonwealth Games Sevens because of political interference, and that lessened the spectacle by not having Fiji, because Fiji are probably the best seven side in the world, or certainly the most fun to watch. So it is a very nuanced situation, but with extra money, maybe the politicians wouldn't be so tempted to steal the money in the first place. So you have this kind of, it needs to be funded more appropriately, and there needs to be people who are rugby people who are above board and who will be able to sort of placate the politicians, be like, look, I'm on your side, I can play both sides here, sort of thing, which is going to be very difficult, clearly, but
yeah, because I suppose, John, the impossible task for World Rugby, and we'll come on to World Rugby and whether they actually exist in any meaningful way in a minute anyway, but the problem for them is they could say, there shouldn't be anybody in a political position who's in control of rugby union in a country. And then, as I think Dan says in the documentary, it's jobs for the boys. So you say to the president, you can't be the CEO, but all it would take is for his brother to then be in charge of rugby.
Yep.
So then it becomes this impossible thing, other than, as Ian says, you bring people back to the country who are rugby people who can run it and have got the experience. But then you've got in documentaries Nateni Talai, who played for Edinburgh, saying, Frank Bahamina can make you disappear, and he will not go back to Fiji.
Yep.
And and you see how scared Dan Leo is of going into the Prime Minister's office in Samoa as well, because of what the Prime Minister called him. I'd called him mentally deranged in a press conference in the past. So this is not, these are not kind of people that will quietly just kind of pass on the power of rugby because they need it so much.
No, and that's the thing. You have a situation where, as you rightly say, you've got that jobs for the boys piece, and it's interesting because I think what struck me most about it was, you talk about, and I know we'll come on to talk about World Rugby, but you talk about the role of almost the independent within this kind of debate, and having sort of almost external adjudication of what the situation is, and it's not possible without the almost the stick of sanctions, and nobody wants to see these countries being sanctioned because of nobody wants to see any sanction on any country in any sport for the mismanagement of the game. If there's going to be sanctions, it has generally will be around maybe drug use or things like that. Nobody wants to see, because a politician is badly running a rugby union that is absolutely critical to the well-being of a lot of people in that area, nobody wants to see them removed from international competition. But ultimately, that's probably what would have to happen if a governing body of some design was to step in and say, do you know what, we have to, this is our rules now and we have to enforce this. So it's just really difficult and really complicated.
Yeah, and what came across, I think, when, again, Dan Leo in the documentary where he's speaking to a member of the Samoa Rugby Union who kind of collars him at this game, is she's saying there's so many conditions attached to the funding that they get from World Rugby, but it doesn't seem like they're necessarily there to prevent political interference. It's almost there to prevent the Pacific Islands from growing. It's all that, there's so many kind of conditions placed on their funding that actually it stunts what they're able to do. They're not able to kind of go as freely as they would. And that from what she was saying, Ian, that's not all, to prevent political interference. A lot of it's just them holding the purse strings.
Yes, but I mean with regards to financing, I think the main issue is the players not getting their just deserts. Yeah. But I mean, World Rugby, if they are, we talked there about them not, they don't seem to they don't interfere. They just sort of go, oh, well, we can't do anything about it. Yeah. But then when it comes to giving the money out, they're like, nah, you need to do this. So they want it both ways, but both ways beneficial to them, sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is Martin Bell makes an interesting point. He says ultimately there isn't, I've hidden Ian behind this comment.
Hey,
you can pick your teeth, Ian, we can't see you. Ultimately, there just isn't the money in the island economy, so it has to come from outside somehow. World Rugby gives grants, which must indeed give them too much control. Funding from a fair share of overseas test matches and TV rights has to come to the core of that. Is that so unrealistic to expect of Tier 1 nations? I think the short answer to that is no. I mean, in the documentary, they talk about, and all Dan Leo's asking for is an 80-20 split. I think it's in your interview as well. He says that, and that's not, any Tier 1 nation is going to be able to afford to give an 80-20 split. The question, I think, what you would need to do, and if World Rugby had any teeth, which it seems it doesn't have any teeth at all, except for when it comes out hand and funding to Tier 2 nations, it would ring-fence some of that money and give it direct to the players. That's kind of, kind of Dan Leo talks in the documentary about, when he was playing for Samoa, they got to seventh in the world, they got to?
Seventh in the world, yep.
We were utter pish at the time. Let's face it. But so that plays partly into it. But they were a formidable side at the time. I think they turned us over. So his view was that they were unable to continue that run because of the mismanagement of the Samoa Rugby Union. Because all of a sudden the experienced players who were coming back from playing in Tier 1 nations and bringing through the younger players weren't able to do that anymore. And so, if you're worrying where your kit is, where your boots are, whether you're getting paid for your match fee, then you're not focused on playing rugby. So when things are going well, and there's a bit of that. I mean, I've read the Ben Ryan book, Seven's Heaven, where he talks about when he taking Fiji to the Olympic championship, like Olympic gold medalists, and in that he does a lot of what he's doing is preventing political interference and kind of keeping that away from the players, and that's a large part of the reason why they were so successful. The moment you've got guys in the dressing room who've got nothing to do with the coach, and then it must be a massive distraction. But come back to the point Martin makes. It's not at the end of the documentary, I think, John, it says that they wrote Pacific Rugby Welfare have written to all the unions, and they've all come back and said this is something we think we can do, but they haven't heard anything else since.
Yeah, it's been over a year now since the last correspondence with regards to it. Yeah, I mean it's unfortunate that this has all kind of come to light just now when most of the unions are broke. And the opportunity to fix this was 5 years ago. The opportunity to fix this was 10 years ago, and get the proper mechanisms in place. But if you think now that the RFU, even the SRU, are going to agree to give away 20% of a much needed gate now, whilst I don't agree. I think they absolutely should be, and the players should be remunerated because they're part of the spectacle. There is this idea of you can't have a game with only one team, so the other team should be rewarded for being there. But the reality of the current situation is they're probably not going to do it, and it's up to guys like Dan, guys like Ben Ryan, us deliriously woke folks here. It's up for all of us to maybe just put a wee bit of pressure on comments, make your voice heard out there, because ultimately nobody's going to do anything that unless there's enough fans behind it. Ultimately, it's our money that funds these organisations. So, we need to do something.
Yeah, and I think there's an opportunity in Scotland, and one of the interesting things from Ian's interview, again, where Dan says that Scotland do more than most other Tier 1 nations in terms of supporting particularly the Pacific Islands and giving them games and going over there, and even I think the attention paid to the welfare of the Pacific Island players who come to Scotland, and how well and that they are looked after, and the pastoral care that's put in there, not just the looking after their fitness and their well-being, but that there is that element of making sure that they're settled and that they're happy. But there is, I think, there is more that the SRU and other unions can do to share the money around. And maybe this is, look at it as an opportunity, coronavirus. It's a chance to have a realignment of funds. So rather than grabbing the money and saying we need to grab all the money we can do, say, well, we're starting with a blank slate here. Let's start from the point of we're budgeting to only receive 80% of our gates when we're playing against another country.
Well, excuse me again. One thing, like you've seen that World Rugby have a COVID relief fund. Now, if they have money squirreled away to help support Tier 1 nations, at unprecedented times, #unprecedented times, how come, I imagine that the amount that Pacific Island nations would need to, or would request, would be significantly less. So why has that not trickled down, or why can't, when Samoa, I mean, we saw that Cooper Vuna, the Bath player, when he was playing for Tonga for a 4-match series, he received £300. Now, why can't World Rugby top that up? Or, with James Haskell's on it, talking at like 500 miles an hour.
You can see how nervous was he on that documentary.
Either that, or how caffeinated was he?
Or it could be something else, but I'm not going to make that joke again. That got in trouble last time. So why can't there be this rebalance? Because Haskell says, they have these meetings and they go, yeah, we should do that. But then, they just forget about it. It's just, it's everything just seems to be lip service going, yeah, that's a good idea, we should, but you don't.
There's nothing to encourage them to do it. That's the thing. There's no, other than #rugby values, which we know is utter tripe, there's nothing to encourage them to do it. There's no fundamental reason, because, let's take Scotland, for example, right? If Scotland were not to play Samoa, Tonga or Fiji, the vast majority, I'm going to say it, the vast majority of BT Murrayfield wouldn't mind. They would prefer playing New Zealand, would prefer playing South Africa, Argentina, Australia. If we played them every autumn, nobody would mind. Nobody would bat an eyelid. And that's the same for all of the bigger countries. We want to see these superstars. When actually, we've all been to see games against Fiji, games against Samoa, Tonga. They're great days out and you see some amazing rugby, but ultimately, most of the crowd are there to see the All Blacks, are there to see the world champion South Africa. So there's no incentive.
Yeah, I mean, Martin makes a point. Martin makes a point, and again saying, would supporters be prepared to pay an additional tenner to a seat to host Samoa at BT Murrayfield? That would generate an extra 670k without impacting SRU cash take. It's an option. I think my view would be they need to give a fair percentage. I think it needs to be agreed. And this is the problem, you can't get agreement, because World Rugby is I think as Charles Piatel describes them as a ghost. Yeah. So I've never seen anyone from World Rugby, they're a ghost. And when you watch the documentary, you realise World Rugby is essentially it's the equivalent of one of those meeting places you hire by the hour when you haven't got a base. Do you know what I mean? That's what it is. It's somewhere for all the unions to get together and try and come to an agreement about what they're going to do. It's got no teeth at all and no enforcement. It can't. The only way they can enforce against, particularly the Tier 1 nations who've got the 2 votes, or 3. Is it 3 votes they get?
3 votes.
3 votes for any decisions that are made, which altogether they have over 50% of the votes compared to the other nations. The only reason that that's just an excuse for them to get together and vote, and it's Turkey's voting for Christmas all the time. No, Brett Gosper and anybody else at World Rugby can't make them do anything. No. Brett Gosper in that documentary says, I can have this conversation with people. I can tell them to think about the long game, but they won't. They're not going to think about how for the good it would be good to grow the Pacific Islands and to have, make them better, make rugby more competitive in the top 20. But everybody's about self-preservation, and I've felt like that way in the past. I've been worried about emerging nations coming through and knocking Scotland off the perch. We've all been there. Do you know what I mean? It's a concern everybody has. But if you want rugby as a sport to survive, at some point, they've got to change their approach. They've got to start. If they hashtag rugby values, if you value rugby and respect and things, it's no good having players there on £300 for an entire £280 a game playing against players who are getting 22 grand a game. That's sort of nonsense.
Having to busk outside restaurants to pay their meal. It's absolutely, and I mean, it's dehumanizing and it's criminal and it's ridiculous.
Yeah. I think that's one of the solutions that probably seems the most sensible, that there is something written down in that you have that a percentage of the gate has to go to your opponent. Because we pay the All Blacks to come and play us. Yeah. I think the other it doesn't happen with other nations. We pay the All Blacks. I mean, was it Tonga or Samoa lost $1 million? Samoa lost $1 million playing the All Blacks at Samoa. That's ludicrous.
Yeah, and you'd think, especially given some of the finger pointing that's come from New Zealand and the fact that they're the neighbours and they have to, I'm not saying this. Some people get overboard and say, "Oh, they're stealing all these Pacific Islanders." Well, they're not stealing them, but they should respect the fact that they are profiting from them, and should reciprocate that. And also, I mean, the thing with World Rugby as well, like you said, when they all meet up for a jolly, I bet it's not somewhere cheap, is it? They're all staying in nice, fancy hotels, and even we can talk about the corruption in the internal unions. Bernard Laporte, who is one of the main sort of decision makers in World Rugby, he's up on corruption charges.
Vice president.
Yep.
And he's up on corruption charges in France. Yeah. There's just a lot of corruption in sport. We saw the absolute shambles that was FIFA when Sepp Blatter was there. Which one of those pigs didn't have their snout in the trough?
I think this is the problem, and then that's the current system of the way that the voting works in World Rugby. I'm very, very clear. I'm not saying it's corrupt, but it's open to corruption. I mean, you only have to look at what happened with the last election, where you had Francis Keane, who's been convicted for manslaughter. There are Amnesty International reports about him individually. You don't often get Amnesty International reports about an individual person. Joe, to me, it's not about countries, but he's named in the report against Fiji. I think there's probably an Amnesty International report just on what Francis Keane has done in prisons in Fiji and the way that he's run the army. And then for the French, the French Rugby Union essentially to nominate him to be a member of the World Rugby Council. And then for Bernard Laporte and Bill Beaumont to turn around when the Pacific Rugby Welfare turn around and say, look, this guy's not a fit and proper person. For them to turn around and say, we didn't know anything about it. You Google Francis Keane, Amnesty International comes up as one of the top results. The fact he's been done for manslaughter comes up as one of the top results on Google. It's not hard. It would take 2 minutes for somebody I don't even know if they have an ethics department.
The fact that him and his brother were part of a military coup to take over the country, do you not pay attention to anything that's going around you?
Of course, a military coup is something different in Scotland. A cow in combat. Anyway, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, you're forgetting the key point here. You're given lots of evidence, lots of things to say Francis not such a good guy, but I'm sure he is in control of those academies that those French people want to be getting players from. So it's you got to take both sides. Maybe France. No, I mean it's absolutely bonkers.
This is why it's open to corruption, because you vote for my guy in the election. You throw and there was no from the outside looking in, Fiji had no reason to vote for Bill Bowman and Bernard Laporte and every reason to vote for. As much as I disagree with him, every reason to vote for Gus Pichot because of the changes that he wanted to make were probably more beneficial to Fiji. But they vote for the incumbents, and on paper they've no reason to do that other than someone is offering funding or saying that's a nice funding arrangement you've got there. It would be a shame if something happened to him. Why don't you vote for my guy and I'll get your guy on the World Council? I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying it's open to that sort of corruption, and it's not corruption in that there's necessarily a personal, although there is personal benefits for some people. It's just corruption in that there are benefits for your union. It's politics as well, but it's not what the sport purports to be.
It's interesting when you think about. So quite often, one of the areas of interest I have is kind of looking at competition within like sporting areas and overall levels of competition, and it's really interesting one of the writers on this talks a lot about kind of individual leagues and individual kind of collectives being a cartel of essentially a cartel of individual clubs who are working to a common benefit, in that it's about revenue maximization for everyone in the league, and actually you have to work together as a collective to do that. It's the old adage of, you see it with the blue and the green mob up here, that without other teams to play, they don't have a league, so they can't make money. And it's really interesting that rugby seems to really, and I think one of the things that's touched on in the documentary, rugby really does have still such a them and us approach, in that it's tier one, and Six Nations, Rugby Championship, maybe Japan now, perhaps.
I don't. Yeah, perhaps. I think the interesting thing when Brett Gosper says, "I can't tell you what a tier 2 nation is," there's no definition for it. I think it comes down to, for me, it comes to voting rights. If you've got 3 votes, that you're tier 1. Anybody else is tier 2.
Yep.
I appreciate Japan have maybe got some financial influence.
Well, that said, that's their way of getting round the limitations of that, is that they have the financial incentives. They're very close with New Zealand. They make sure their players are well looked after. So again, there's more politics at play. And one of the things we talk a lot about when you're talking about making these leagues or collectives more competitive is that the first thing you have to start with is equal distribution. So that is voting rights and revenue. There has to be a more equal distribution of these across the piece. So the easiest thing to do is one team, one vote. It's really simple. Now, there's no way the Six Nations guys are going to vote for that. It's interesting that they won't, though, because they've already got the legacy benefits. They've got their tournament that makes their millions every year. They don't have to worry about that. So what is there to be afraid of other than being usurped every autumn and maybe in the World Cup? It's silly.
Yeah. I think the other thing, we'll come back to the finance things as well. What Danley was talking in is about the fact that they don't get notice of when they're going to get a game. They get no games at all pretty much during the year. They've got their own Pacific Championship that they do. There's the repechage for qualifying for the World Cup. Occasionally someone might drop in on the way over on the summer as part of the summer tours. The autumn, they probably get a few. They might get a couple of games against the big boys between them, but not much. And that, the big impact on that is obviously that they can't attract sponsorship. You see this. Scotland have announced their autumn tests for 2021. We've got All Blacks and
it's Australia and South Africa.
Australia, South Africa. And TBC. Now we know that TBC is either Georgia or Pacific Island, or a Canada or a USA. Why it can't be announced now, so that they have time, one, to fund. They need to fundraise from their communities, and also why they can't announce it now to get sponsors seems to me utterly mad. So the system needs to change. We've talked about the global calendar before, and even if you're not going to get a combined calendar of this mad competition they suggested of the international, what was it called, the International Nations Championship, the Nations League or League of Nations, which sounds like something that Lex Luthor was in charge of. Even not something like that, but there's no reason you can't set a calendar at the start for a whole World Cup cycle. say, and then everyone would have certainty about who they were playing. You could have fair, even distribution of the tours, and I think there was talk that that's what they were doing. But it seems mad that we can't know that that's only agreed amongst the big boys. You know, that everyone would get a turn at New Zealand and everyone would do this. The other people,
agreements.
The reciprocal agreements, yes,
yeah,
which only exist amongst the tier 1 nations and don't exist between the other nations. But it seems mad we can't do some sort of draw. The interesting analogy I think Dan Leo draws is the draw where the FA Cup where you get a minnow up against Man United and they end up playing away at Man United to get a section of the gate, and that's probably funds them for 5 years.
Yep. We've been doing it in football for how many years, and yet we still have this completely. It would be fine if it was equal. It would be fine if teams were to go over to the islands and we're playing at a 67,000 all-seater stadium, paying £100 a ticket, and the union was benefiting from that. But it's just not the case. So there has to be a realistic solution to that, and revenue share is the realistic solution.
You agree with that, Ian?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's socialism, but we're already woke, so we must be socialist as well. I don't see why. For example, in order to, we've seen how Argentina have made leaps and bounds since they've been invited to the Rugby Championship.
Yeah.
Why can't they extend it? Maybe knock off a Bledsoe Cup game, because they usually have 3 of them, and invite Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And so it's like we've got the 6 nations; they could have 7 teams playing. And is that so hard to manage? I mean, I think one of the biggest problems now would be ensuring that certain clubs, French, would release players. But if World Rugby insist upon it, which they probably wouldn't, because they wouldn't want to upset the tier 1 nations, you would get a more competitive product. Because that's one of the things he says, in our chat, is that if you go into a World Cup with more, there's more than 4 teams with a realistic chance of actually winning the damn thing, it's improved competition. And if it's an improved product, because we know how exciting Fiji and Samoa and Tonga can be, you'll attract more people. Because, and I know this might be someone's hands in the rock about how rugby can seem dull right now, but to the sort of the guy on the street, if you just dragged them and go, "Oh mate, you want to come and watch this rugby game?" they wouldn't understand it and they would get a bit bored by it. But if you have it more competitive, then it's even just the drama of sport would be enough.
Look at the amount of people talking about the rugby code that shall not be named and the end to the final the other week there, and how dramatic that was. The people who have no interest in rugby were mentioning it because of
social media now, right? You can get these little clips. No one's gonna retweet a clip.
Oh, Cammy seems to have broken.
You need exciting rugby to gif it and meme it and do your little clips.
Well, that's
You broke for a second there, Cammy.
I did break for a second, but it's fine because I'm recording my end, and so it's fine. Dougie, look, before we move on, we'll move on to players in a minute, because I thought, we'll have a half an hour chat about it, but we're on for 50 minutes already. Dougie Lowe says, wouldn't it be great to see the likes of Fiji, Samoa, Tonga coming over for an old-fashioned tour like we used to see, playing Edinburgh, Glasgow, the South and North Midlands would be nice too, but that's a different matter. And finishing off playing Scotland, hopefully plenty of income for them too. I think the difficulty with that is that the calendar now is so packed for pro teams that
you've already
it's a lovely idea. I think the romantic in me would love to see it. I mean, I'd love to you'd love to see I wish it was still the case that All Blacks could come play the south of Scotland. I mean, it's absolutely howked these days, but that you kind of hark back to those days, and that'd be a nice thing to see, a nice thing to do. But I think the calendar's so packed these days. And the drop off, the other thing is with the drop off in talent. I mean, you could probably squeeze a game against a Super 6 select, but Samoa are going to run absolute rings around a Super 6 select coming over. So I think romantically I'd love to see it, but practically I don't think it's a go, Ian.
Yeah, well, in the days of amateurism, that would be fine. But the professionals now, they are so super trained and so much better. That it would be a absolute millering. And like you said as well, the fixtures congestion. That one of the issues with, well, not an issue, but one of the consequences of professionalism is, of course, we know that players are getting hit harder, and therefore that means they can't play as many games. So it's a lovely suggestion, but probably unfeasible unless there was some kind of change to the club calendar, and then the clubs are going to raise their arms about that because then that's going to damage their income. And it's like, oh, but that player is our property, they are our asset. No, we don't. They may get injured. You can't have them.
Yeah, and I think the other kind of thing that you have, and the other issue that's raised in the documentary, is around Pacific Island players and what happens to them when they leave the Pacific Islands. That yes, there are international windows where clubs are required to release players, but there are also players being taken from academies in Tonga and Samoa and Fiji to Japan and New Zealand and Australia, and having clauses put in their contract to say you will not play international rugby. Do you know?
Yeah.
And from a young age as well. Apparently, there's, I think, some of the lads going over to academies in Japan and stuff. They're signing contracts to say you will not play international rugby, and that's that. Come back to rugby values. It's not exactly in keeping, is it, John?
No, it's not, and again, it's just dirty. It's dirty business, isn't it? And as you rightly say, it's kids, it's young kids, and I don't understand where. I mean, it's exploitation of the absolute definition of child exploitation, which is very, very illegal in a lot of countries. But it's a really bad one.
Yeah, I mean, somebody challenged me on Twitter last week saying, look, what's the difference between the way that a Pacific Island kid is treated compared to, say, Jordan Venter, who's coming across to Edinburgh? And like, I mean, I didn't really respond because I don't really see the point, because the person that was tweeting at me you could see the agenda that they had. But you give it some thought and you watch the documentary, you think, well, Jordan Venter isn't sending money home to a large to keep it to a large family. I mean, it's 30% of GDP in the Pacific Islands is estimated to come from rugby players sending money back. So Jordan Venter isn't sending money back to keep his family in, fed and clothed back home. If Jordan Venter has a medical problem, has a kid, his kidneys failing him, he's not going to be stuck in Romania. I mean, with no help, living off the benefits of churches like the top former Tongan international that's in that documentary. Jordan Venter, if he hits any problem at all, will have somebody on the end of the phone he can call, and that's not available to Pacific Island players who, quite rightly will go and chase the economic benefits that are open to them across the world. And we're talking about Spain, we're talking about Romania, we're talking about these nations that are trying to bring the standards up in their leagues, and the quick way to do that is you get in players who can hit the ground running. And where do you go to get a player like that? You don't go to the Super Six in Scotland. You don't go to the English Championship, because you go to the Pacific Islands, because you can, you'll get somebody that can come in and play.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like that example you made there, Super Six players on $12,500 a year. Sione Tamafunga, who's the Tongan, who he played against Scotland, I think, in the 2011 World Cup. He was on £8,000 a year in Romania.
That's crazy. I mean, you think what a former rugby international in a tier 1 nation, even a one cap former rugby international, will be dining out on that for decades. After dinner speaking, people will sort them out with a job because of who they are. It's not it's a high paid job, but someone will always have their back as a former international. But you go below tier 1, and unless you're one of the big, the really big headline players, those opportunities just aren't there for you.
They'll make more than $8,000 doing the cameo appearances.
Yeah, it's just and I think it's very depressing. And I wonder how much of a chance that players, I think someone like Jordan Venter or someone from a tier 1 nation, I think this is a bit of, where kind of a kind of, it's not deliberate racism, but it's kind of the microaggressions come in. I don't think that Pacific Island players are given the same chances to adapt in other countries to the way that the game's played, or the same investment in training that a white South African youngster would be given, because I think they're expected. Or you're from Fiji, you're from Tonga, you're from Samoa. You should be able to come in. You should be able to dance around 5 lads and offload like crazy. I don't think they're given the same opportunity to fail that a white South African lad would be given coming to a different country.
Yeah, there's also there is an element of the cultural expectations being, there's negative traits that are expected as well. And when any incident happens, it's often blamed on the fact they're from the Pacific Islands, as opposed to the player themselves, or the situation they find themselves in. You even see it with the amount of Glasgow fans we've seen shouting and bawling about Nakarawa not having played this season, and people are pointing out that he was back in Fiji and there was an actual personal matter that he was back in Fiji for.
Yeah.
So if that had been a white South African player, well, Jaco.
Well, no, because Jaco, he's gone off and gone back for his wedding, right?
Yep.
Come back and self-isolated. Everyone said, "Oh, that's nice when he's gone for his wedding."
Yep.
Leone Nakarawa's had to stay out in Fiji for longer because I understand. I think his wife was pregnant, and then there's been some other family matters, and he's building a house for his family. And you watch the documentary, and you understand then that what building a house means is not kind of, I'm a rich rugby player, Mum, here's some money to pay off your mortgage. It's literally physically building them a house. That, but everyone's like, oh, well, he's lazy, he's not coming back. It's not the same. It's not, the situations just aren't comparable. And they're not, like you said, John, they're not given, fans don't give the same leeway to these players as they give to, Jaco van der Walt. Have a nice wedding. See you again in 2 weeks. What's he playing at?
If Jaco had been late back,
we're getting hammered.
Aye, exactly. If Jaco had been late back, right, it's complications in South Africa or whatever, and he'd been late back, and Duncan Weir had got injured in training, and we were down to, and Pete Horn got a call up at 10, right, just to give Ian the rage. Nobody would have batted an eyelid. Nobody would have said, you know what, that's really selfish of Jaco that he's doing that, and I can't believe he's cost Scotland, he's cost our country, this and that. If it had been in the same situation, people have said that about Pacific Island players. They've said how selfish it is that they're staying back in Fiji. That guy would get fired by Racing for it,
Yeah. Yes, and I think it's frustrating. I think that, and I don't understand why. The Pacific Rugby Welfare aren't recognised by World Rugby as a union because World Rugby don't fund them. Despite the fact it was them that brought up the fact that Francis Keane was not a fit and proper person, and World Rugby's response was, we don't recognise you, but very quietly we're going to drop him and suggest to Fiji very quietly that he's kind of shuffled out of all of a sudden he's shuffled out of the Fiji Union, is he? That's got nothing to do with the report put together by Pacific Rugby Welfare. I mean, I think obviously they'd much rather be on the inside, having people listen to what they've got to say. I think it's, in a way, I think the message is much stronger at the minute because they are on the outside and people are listening to them more and saying and kind of questioning World Rugby alongside them, which is good. The last kind of point I want to touch on, the eligibility. I know you and I did a podcast on this, Ian, for Patreons. You sign up for our Patreon, patreon.com/Scottish Rugby Podcast. You can listen to that, Ian and I talking about that at length. The first thing is the impact that the 5-year rule has had unintentionally. And I think that this was a Gus Pichot thing. I think it's particularly to address an Argentinian problem, that the Argentinian players, they don't pick on residency. And so I think it was trying to restrict other unions who maybe have more immigration, just natural immigration to the country anywhere, as a way to kind of like restrict their ability to do it. But, I think in the interview, Dan Leo was kind of talking to you about the fact that what that's caused is that big unions like New Zealand, like Australia, are going and getting players younger.
Yeah, because in the documentary, the rugby, Tonga Academy Rugby, it's a 13-year-old That's New Zealand, a team in New Zealand, or I don't know if it was the union itself or a single team that were scouting. And, Rupeni Cow, there's teams already sniffing after his son, and he's 11.
Right, 11.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not like the case where, Lionel Messi, when he went to Barcelona at the age of 12, right, Argentina, he's from a sort of fairly, sort of, not impoverished, probably, a lot better off than the Pacific Islands are. But Barcelona were like, this is a special talent. This is ridiculously good talent. We will look after him. The contract was signed on a napkin. So it's a slightly different kettle of fish to going over and saying, well, here's an 11-year-old child. Well, we can just give them, a wee bit of money here, take them over, turn them into a player, and then use them for our own good.
Scotland are not innocent, though. We're not innocent in this either. The fact is, you've mentioned Jordan Venter. He's not coming over to Scotland as a young boy because we think he's a future South African international, and we're just giving him a contract for a couple of years. Let's be honest.
No, and I think there is an element of that. I mean, Jordan Venter, I think, is Scots qualified through his grandfather, but we are bringing him across because he is. Is that not true?
It's the boy that Glasgow have signed.
He's Scots qualified. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. But and that's understandable. But I think the reason that young South African players are leaving South Africa is because there aren't the opportunities in South Africa, because South Africa is so well stocked and well funded for its rugby that actually, you can go and kind of try your luck elsewhere. That's not the reason why young Pacific Island players are leaving the Pacific Islands. Jordan Venter probably could. Do you want to be it's the big fish, small pond thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Go and try yourself in a smaller pool and see how you get on. So that's the reason why it's not kind of because your family needs money and someone's offering you a lot of money as an 11-year-old to go and train and maybe take a gamble on you that one day you'll be an international. So I think, for me, I think there's probably an argument to go back to the 3-year rule. I don't necessarily think that the 5-year rule, I don't think it makes a difference, those 2 years, if I'm perfectly honest at all. The other thing is this idea of dropping back and players returning. It's like the kind of returning rule that you can play for New Zealand, and then when New Zealand are done with you, but like Charles Piutau, you can go back and play for that your mum's your nation, your grandfather's nation. And I think that's the point they make in the documentary is you can, that experience then is invaluable to improving the fortunes of those countries. And who wouldn't want to see some of those players extend their careers, right? Who wouldn't want to see someone have another crack at a World Cup at the age of 35 when New Zealand are done or Australia are done with them? It makes sense. I hadn't realized actually it was only two. Everyone talks about the history of eligibility and rugby, keeping rugby meaningful. I mean, God, I think you qualified for Scotland back in the 1800s if you'd been on holiday there or at public school there. They only changed this rule about representing a second union in 2001.
That's right. Yeah.
So we're not talking the deep, dark annals of history, are we?
No, not at all. You've got like the likes of Jamie Salmon, represented both New Zealand and England. And up to and including the 90s. Frank Bunce as well.
Frank Bunce, Samoa, New Zealand. Samoa is his first, and this is it works both ways. You can to provide opportunities for players. You could be a young player playing for Samoa, get a Super Rugby contract, and if you're eligible, not through whether it's through residence, whether it's through a parent, to then go and play for New Zealand.
Well, the rule that they want to bring in though is it would only be tier 1 down to tier 2.
Tier 1 down. Yeah.
I disagree. Yeah. I think it has to be much more. I was thinking about this today. I think you could go more radical, because I think it probably has application. I think in the documentary, and we've said this before, that it's this thing. We don't live in a society now where people stay in one place, or their parents and their grandparents are from the same town and nobody's ever moved. People move all around the world. People's grandparents have immigrated and emigrated and whatever. I think you could decide at the start of a World Cup cycle. So this is who I'm going to play for this World Cup cycle. And if you want to change during a World Cup cycle, you've got to go 12 months without playing for a country. So say, for example, New Zealand, you get dropped by New Zealand after 2 years, and they're not interested in you anymore, but you could go and do a job for Fiji, that you could say, okay, I'm giving you notice, World Rugby, that I'm having my 12-month grace period where I'm not going to play for anybody, and then I'm going to switch my allegiance. I'll give you 12 months notice of me doing that. And you could do that in Great Britain, and it's a choice then for the unions and for the individuals as to whether they want to do that. And not, unions don't have to do it just because they've got it, but you could have that within England, Scotland, and Wales. There's plenty of players that might want to come and play for Scotland that might get better, and suddenly England might come sniffing around. It's just we've got Ali Price is from Norfolk, isn't he?
Yes,
good point. Plenty of.
Johnny Williams, for example, who scored against England last week for Wales. He scored for England against the Barbadians like the year before, but it was a non-cap match.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is. I think there needs to be an acceptance that I think you need to take nationalism out of. Just strip nationalism away from rugby altogether. If you could qualify through, and maybe you just drop it back to parent, for example, rather than grandparent, just to make it a bit more simpler, and you take residence out of it for switching nations, and you say it's only place of birth and parent. You can choose in a World Cup cycle who you're going to go with, and then if you drop for 12 months and you give 12 months notice, you can change to whoever you want. And then it's up to unions whether they want to use that, and it's up to players whether they'd agree with that as well.
Well, I was just looking at I was just looking at the Olympic Charter rule there. That's 3 years. The Olympic Charter requires only that an athlete be a national of the country for which he or she is competing. If they want to compete for a different nation, it has to be 3 years after they last competed for their country of origin.
Yeah.
So you have to take 3 years off, which is essentially the same as 3 years residency. But but I was thinking that it would be, you're thinking about guys like Stephen Armitage, who was obviously down in France, was qualified to play for France. What? What are you making signs for, Ian?
All right, I'll just tell everyone I have to go pee. I'll be back in 2
All
minutes.
right, okay, thanks.
Ian's off to pee.
I didn't understand his
you're right,
gang signs there.
He had two caps or something for England.
Yeah, and he was the form 7 in European rugby at the time, but because he was playing in France, because of the rules England had, he wasn't getting picked. He said himself, "Look, what? I'll play for France. If I could, I would play for them." And that's not him being just a mercenary. It was, he had an offer. He was qualified to play for another country, and he felt part of that and wanted to represent them. And I think we've got this idea of nationalism so messed up that we still believe it's like borders and bloodshed almost, and we should all be marching with flags. It's a very small world out there these days.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. I've got a comment from Josh Paul who says my dissertation for uni is on nationalism and my current assignment is on systemic corruption. You lads are hitting close to home. I'm pleased that the level of discourse in this podcast is hitting the standards of a dissertation for a university.
It doesn't tell us what university though.
University of Life.
Aye. I know when you've seen that on people's Facebook profiles.
Yeah,
University of Life.
Yeah, Josh, if you get a 2-1 or a first, then we get a proportion of whatever you earn after that. I think that's only fair. Yeah. So the whole. I think in conclusion, the whole thing's entirely depressing.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
I don't see anything. Oh, Josh is in Stirling.
He's in Stirling. That okay? I will allow. Good job, Josh. And I'm delighted that, as Cammy says, our level of discourse has. I'm glad that you're not coming on and saying my dissertation is on this, and you guys are talking absolute rot, which is good.
Yeah. So
what did I miss?
You just missed this. Apparently that we've been talking at a university dissertation level for this entire podcast, so we're just giving ourselves a pat on the back for that. And
we're getting honorary degrees from Stirling because of Josh.
Yeah. Oh, excellent.
That's great. We go and see the ducks in the pond. Right? Nice lake at Stirling. I was just concluding. It's all depressing. I don't really see anything changing. I think we can all do our part. If you listen to the interview with Dan Lee, he talks. They're going to be Pacific Rugby Welfare releasing a letter that you'll be able to send to your home union, and we can do that. So we can put pressure on the SRU to start to take that stand. I think, like Dan Leo says, Scotland do more than most. when it comes to the Tier 1 nations supporting Pacific Islands, but there's no reason why we can't do more, and hopefully we'll see some change there. I'm going to move on now. We're going to do a quick one of these. Well, we looked high and we looked low, we singled it back on in speedos, but I just want to know, did you see the legend that's Dougie Donnelly? Yes, it's Where's Dougie Donnelly, and speaking of Pacific Islanders, we've got a very special Where's Dougie Donnelly tonight. Craig Simpson got in touch on Twitter, and he said, I spotted Big Bill Matter at the Sight Hill Scott Mid. Not a clue what he was buying, but I'm going to take a guess that it was 2 steak bridies, a fudge donut, a bottle of Iron Brew, and a big bag of Haribo.
Or as we commonly know that, the Finn Russell.
Yeah, so I don't think Bill Mata and Leona Nakarawa joined up with Fiji before the coronavirus outbreak. So I think probably as soon as that outbreak happened, they were told to stay where they were. So they're still Miller. I saw he was on his Insta stories. Bill Mata was out at Sainsbury's the other day. So
well, he's been injured as well. He only made his comeback against Ulster, which went spectacularly.
Yeah, I mean he's a player, though, I think that, you hear about when he came to Scotland that was looked after quite well, that, the nutritionist particularly took him shopping when he first got here to make sure that he was in good nick, spoke to Ben Ryan, who was obviously his coach when he played sevens, and, just to make sure that he was, that he was happy and coming to Scotland, because it must be a bloody strange move from the Pacific Islands to kind of come in here, especially with the bloody weather.
It's interesting. We're the furthest away from the islands, and we're the ones that have done the body most.
Well, it's Benetiga can take, I think, the greatest credit for that.
Yeah.
He's been a settlement officer, and now he's like an official liaison. He's been a settlement officer since he retired, and it was his main mandate was to look after the Southern Hemisphere guys, because, as Dan said in the interview, I think it was at 2012 or 2013, like 4 or 5 Southern Hemisphere players actually killed themselves. Pacific Islander players killed themselves.
Yeah,
and that's is that what you want rugby to be? A game where we just bring people over, treat them like pieces of meat, and then once they're done with them, check them out? No.
And there's some nice, some really good interviews. I mean, you go search for Benetiga, like some of the work he was doing early in lockdown to kind of keep in touch with the Pacific Island lads in Scotland, particularly the ones that are living on their own. And when you watch the documentary, you realise how important community is to them. So how much of an impact that has, being on their own and being isolated, and the work he was doing to try and help there. So that's I think there is. I don't know, blow our own trumpet, but we are doing more than most, but we can still certainly do more. If you want to have a preview of the Ireland Scotland game, there's not much to get into because we don't know the team as we record this. Kevin Miller's done a preview on the blog, so go and have a read of that. But I'll put you on the spot now, both of you. I mean, are we hopeful this weekend, John?
Yes, we are, especially if Johnny Sexton plays.
Ian?
Always hopeful. Yeah, we know how Ireland are going to play because they've not changed at all under Andy Farrell from the way they did with Joe Schmidt. It was a hell of a game in the Six Nations. Hopefully we can just get over the line this time. Do you think Yako will start, or do you think Duncan Weir will start?
Ooh,
I think Yako will start. I'm going to throw it out there.
I believe Yako will start.
I said last week I thought Duncan Weir would start, so I'm totally just like...
Yeah,
flip flopper.
It'll be interesting. He'll definitely be there or thereabouts, I would have thought. So, let's move on. We're going to do we'll do this now. Yes, it's Hands in the Ruck time. This is our Any Other Business section of the podcast where we ask you to get in touch with things that have just generally annoyed you or things that have pleased you in the past week in the world of rugby. We've got a few on social media before I come to the two of you. Some of them might cross over. Alan McDonald, long-time listener and friend of the podcast, says his Hands in the Ruck was the bigger official who posted on a certain rugby forum asking if the 26 abstaining clubs wanted to own up when they voted for Biggar not to be promoted. He said, Biggar have a right to feel aggrieved, but that level of petulance has taken me from sympathetic to F off in one swell swoop. Yeah. I mean, we talked about this the other week, and we were saying, and I can understand actually why a club would abstain, because if you're mid-table, you've no skin in the game.
That's what we said last week, wasn't it? There's absolutely there's no reason whatsoever for them to get involved, other than, it's if they do get involved, they're setting a precedent, and we don't need to be doing that. If they've got nothing to gain from it,
I think if the clubs that are up for promotion, the clubs that voted for relegation were voting and gone in their way, then fine. But I think there's a lot of you're a mid-table club. I don't think you necessarily want to be voting for people to get relegated. You
want the status quo. Of course you do. It's fine.
Next we've got some people have got what I think is going to be yours, Ian, so I'll leave that to yours. We've got Matt Dawson's idiocy, says Richard Gray. This was mine. Now this is just generally anybody over the age of about 50 who's watched who's kind of calls back to some bygone era that never happened. And all the ex-players, every single time this happens, it happens every year. Rugby's not the same anymore. Rugby's boring. Rugby's dull. We need some rules to make it more exciting. I mean, Matt Dawson and his blog suggested that you should limit the number of people at the ruck, and also should limit scrums. And I was like, that's rugby league.
Yeah.
And also somebody else I was talking to this week said he's obviously never watched any rugby in the past 5 years because nobody's throwing people at rucks anyway these days. Teams are already limiting the number of players they're committing to rucks anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. Yeah, exactly. This is mad. And then Jeremy Guscott had his 2 pennies worth in the rugby paper, saying he was talking about Muhammad Ali and Joe Fraser, and saying, no, I like Muhammad Ali because he was entertaining and he was really exciting to watch as a boxer, and Joe Fraser wasn't. I was like, Muhammad Ali's most famous win was him leaning against the ropes, literally soaking up pressure and then hitting somebody on the counter. That's his most famous win. Wasn't him skipping about the place, kind of throwing flies. His most famous win was an incredibly dull encounter where he got beaten about the head and then kind of tired his opponent out, which is what the All Blacks do every week.
It's the park the bus approach, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was actually Floyd Mayweather was the
other one. I couldn't remember. I was so outraged.
Yeah. And that's like what annoys me is people like, oh, the game's rubbish, blah blah. They weren't saying that after the New Zealand Australia First Bledisloe Cup game. We're talking about 2 weekends of, maybe not the most exciting rugby, played in honking conditions, some of them,
shocking weather,
and with guys who have hardly played a competitive match in months together. They've not been able to train together as much. So, I think maybe just temperance doesn't get you clicks, so does it?
Yeah. No. And the kick, and then people still going, why are teams kicking away possession? It's because they're going for territory. The best teams in the world have been doing it for about 20 years.
We've all just clicked. It's the thing you do.
You don't win matches running the ball out of your own 22. You don't win matches hitting ruck after ruck after ruck at the halfway line. You win matches by winning territory. Kick the ball to the opposition and say, come on, have a go. And you win penalties. And you're more likely to win a penalty in the 22 by kicking a ball to your opposite number and hoping he fluffs it and hoping you can get a turnover than in their half than you're trying to kind of go around the corners at the halfway line.
Yeah, so. people are finally clicking to this, but it's.
And if you don't like it, go watch. If you don't like it, if you want to entertain rugby, go and watch rugby league. It is, on all levels, it is a more entertaining version of rugby to watch. It's a faster version of rugby to watch, but for the I prefer rugby union. If I was to I know that sounds controversial, but think about it. Somebody comes down for a space and says to you, I've heard about this sport rugby. I understand there's 2 versions. Which version is the more entertaining to watch? You go and watch a game of league. you say to him, look, if you want to spend a long time, if you're really into your rules, mate, and you're really into kind of, lots of stoppages and lots of really technical things, and kind of like more of a kind of game of chess, rugby union's for you. If you want to just go and be entertained for, however long a rugby league match is, 80 minutes, go and watch rugby league.
The thing is, I've seen some really boring games of rugby league, and one of them, a couple of them were state of origin games, and the reason they were boring was because the teams were so good at defending, like nobody scored. I think like one I'd watched, and this was like back was in jail, I think it finished 6-4.
Yeah. Good defense can be entertaining. You just have to, switch your expectations.
Well, that's to the point. Actually, in the most entertaining part of the Glasgow game on Sunday was there was there was some amazing defence from Lee Jones, but there was like a moment in the second half where there was like 3 absolutely smashing hits in a row just as the ball gets shipped on, and it was absolutely brilliant. And it says a lot about the rest of the game that was the highlight.
Well, you look at who got man of the match. Lee Jones got man of the match against Glasgow, and that was for his defence.
For his defence, yeah.
As a winger,
Parley put in an incredible tackle
up on the wing,
winger. He looked like a try all day, but somehow he managed to get there. I think Kevin Miller tweeted about it. He's got a big gif of Kevin Miller.
Yeah, it was Somerville.
Somerville, yeah, that's the lad.
Yeah.
Ian, what's your hands in the ruck?
So we've all heard about Pablo Matera, and my hands in the ruck is people who are defending him. Now, of course, we're going to get called overly woke here, so I'm just going to caveat this for sort of saying, I have said some absolutely loathsome things in my time: sexism, racism, sectarian, whatever. I've said them, and it was, it was years ago, and it's a lot of the time it's never been in anger. A lot of the time it was just like group. You can call it a toxic masculinity. This group of mates, when you're just trying to outdo each other in terms of who can be more offensive. But I would never put them in public sphere because it's not something that I believe. Now, you can go on about how young Matera was, and it was X years ago, but the fact of the matter is, it's over an extended period of time. It's not just like one instance. I think there's 5 of them, and it covers classism, racism, and sexism. Now, if you are a high-profile person and you think, oh my God, I remember when I said some shocking things, I should probably go back and delete that. You go and do it. People defend him saying it was years ago. It doesn't matter, right? It was still out there. He's said these abhorrent things repeatedly, and now he has to suffer the consequences. He's apologised, which is good. I'm all for giving him a second chance. I believe in rehabilitation. You've seen people who've been in prison and been junkies and what have you, and now they've got degrees and things like that. I fully believe that people can change and become better people, but you have to suffer some kind of consequence for your actions.
Somebody said he'd been sacked. I was like, he got dropped from the captaincy. That's not being sacked. You want to be, being sacked is being told to clear out your desk and leave the office. Do you know what I mean? That's not being. Seemingly,
he's stepping down. I think it was Rugby Dump. I didn't read the whole article. I think it's just rumours. But as long as he serves his time or whatever, and if he then becomes like a sort of figurehead for good. If he's, if now that he's got this high profile, if he can be like head of an anti-racism campaign or whatever, that's good. That will encourage people who look up to kids who look up to him, not to be make the same mistakes that he did.
Yeah, there was a really interesting thread on. I really appreciate this because I kind of made the same point as you, Ian, and a few people came back and said, "Oh, it's all part of a bigger conspiracy in Argentina." Because for anybody that didn't see it, the All Blacks placed a number 10 shirt, All Black shirt. Some people saying, why was it an All Black shirt? But it's like, I know what it's like trying to get stuff ordered in Australia. It's impossible to get stuff. There's no way you get an Argentinian football kit posted to you in that many days, with that turnaround. So they've got number 10 All Black shirt, and they've put on the halfway line before the haka, obviously in tribute to Diego Maradona. And I think the reaction in Argentina has been one of disgust with the Argentinian side that they didn't do their own tribute, and that when that shirt was placed down, that nobody went and collected it. Nobody responded to that tribute from the All Blacks. And I hadn't really realised this when somebody else was explaining that the rugby in Argentina, a little bit like it is in England and Edinburgh to an extent, is an upper class sport. So all these players, Pablo Montero, all these guys that play rugby in Argentina are all public school boys, effectively, and they all, can do what they want and get away with what they want. There's instances of rugby players beating up, people in the streets and being able to kind of get away with that. So it's, that there is a class issue there that, Diego Maradona was this working class hero and he has been disrespected by the upper classes. Now that may well be the reason why somebody has thought, I'm going to have a dig about this guy's tweets. It might just be that all of a sudden Pablo Montero is in the public eye because of the last couple of weeks he's played particularly well. There's been a couple of memeable things he's done on the rugby pitch, where he's pointing to his chest and saying that's not respect and I represent my country. Just somebody's gone back through his Twitter and, like you saying, there's no excuse for it to be there, regardless of why someone has decided to go off and troll for it. That might be because they don't think he showed Maradona the particular level of respect. It doesn't matter. He still said those things, and you can conspiracy all you want. It doesn't matter. It doesn't detract from that. People saying we should be asking questions about why somebody's decided to do it. It doesn't matter. He said it. It's out there. That's the headline story. We shouldn't worry about the classism issue within Argentina. That doesn't kind of touch the surface.
You should be asking questions as well of, I think we're all of an age where we were young and probably, as Ian rightly says, said stupid stuff when social media didn't exist. And there's highly trained professionals who brand manage all of this behind the scenes, and there's almost a question to be asked as to why this, we're saying, why hasn't that been deleted by him? Why hasn't that been deleted by a social media manager? Why hasn't someone, as soon as he's representing Argentina, went, do you know what, logins, please let's have a wee scour and just make sure, because it happens in other countries. You know.
And everybody jumped on saying, oh well, someone's obviously left that there playing the long game so they can catch him out. It's like, no, somebody's just been incompetent. That's it's incumbent. Someone's not. They've not had a proper social media manager in place to say you might want to pull that. A bit like that time. A bit like that time that Ali Price had to delete a tweet laughing at Simon Zebo calling. Or did he like the tweet where Simon Zebo called Finn Russell white chocolate?
That's right. Yeah.
After Finn Russell left camp, and obviously someone had a word and told Ali Price to not like that tweet. But yeah, I think it's depressing the fact people will say, somebody said to me there are bigger issues here at play, and I don't think there's really bigger issues than homophobia and racism. Hard to think of any. Certainly not kind of internal class struggles within Argentina. I would put that at if we're ranking things, I would put that at less than homophobia and racism.
And ultimately, he is the captain of his country. He is a representative of his country. So, come on.
Yeah. In his own words, that is not respect.
Correct. There you go.
John, have you got hands in the ruck this week?
Do you know what I have? I've done my classic thing of, as we've been talking, I've come up with one, because that's what we do. We do not prepare. We
off the cuff.
Off the cuff. Fail to prepare to fail, as they say. So I was going to talk originally about why, and this is one of Ian's favourites, but it's been really evident over the last couple of weeks, actually, that Pete Horne, who is starting for Glasgow at 10, Glasgow look infinitely better as soon as Brandon Thompson comes on at 10. Like, infinitely better. And Brandon Thompson is not my favourite rugby player in the world. That's, I think, been documented on here a few times. I may have suggested he possibly had the worst game of rugby in the history of rugby one time. But, Glasgow have been so much better when Thompson's come on. But actually, the thing that stood out most for me was there was a break in play during the first half of the Glasgow game on Sunday, and there was more medics and water boys on the park than there was players. It was outrageous how many people. There was I think there was 7 or 8 people down getting bandaged up. There was water bottles. There was other people running about. it was insane. And I was just thinking, like, why? There's almost an argument. Why? I know we've got to allow players to get patched up, and that's fine. I'm all for that. Player welfare completely. But a lot of this does seem like we've had to run about for more than 6 minutes. So I really, really need to lie down. And forwards have done it throughout the ages. They'll take a knee. A lot of it seemed like that. And I don't know if it's becoming more of a problem. It struck me as quite strange.
I think the thing you see, and you'll see it with Scotland, is Mike Blair is a water boy, and he's got the earpiece in, and he's communicating to the team.
Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of that goes on in rugby. I do wonder whether or not there's an argument to say, medics are allowed earpieces because they've got to communicate, but nobody else going and giving water is allowed earpieces.
Yeah, I mean,
because I think that I wonder how much of it's that. I wonder how much of it is get instructions to the players on the pitch, rather than it being. And if you cut that out, if you restrict you say it's only player, only subs can go on and bring the water.
So it's
you'd still find a way of you'd still find a reason to bring a way of getting messages on, hide it in the water or something, or in your shorts or whatever. But it would make it less attractive to do that, I guess.
And I think you're getting to the stage now where you're seeing, as I say, I mean, I'm exaggerating for, before we get letters, I'm exaggerating for the benefit of entertainment, but there was almost as many extra staff as there was players in the park. And you're almost at the stage now where there's like an individual coach for each player going on, and I'll bring your water bottle. And by the way, the big dog upstairs was giving me a message for you. This is your individual coaching. Yeah. It's strange. But just on, if I could just do one more wee note, just in the, I actually want to do a positive. I want to pass on some congratulations. So I noticed Newcastle Falcons. I was watching the game they were playing recently, and I noticed they are trialling the concussion tests that are worn on the neck. It's a small white patch that's worn on the neck, and it's to diagnose concussion quickly. And they're doing one of the clubs that are trialing that. So looked a bit strange. It was one of those moments, but obviously couldn't be, a very important thing. And if it improves welfare even a 0.1%, then it's the right thing to do. So well done.
Can we send something to Arsenal?
Sorry?
Can we send something to Arsenal?
Yeah. I think that there was probably other situations where I would suggest concussion might have been easily diagnosed, and it wouldn't have required a fast-acting test to diagnose. The fact that he had blood pouring through the bandage that was put on him was probably a giveaway.
Yeah.
And if you've been in a collision which fractures another man's skull,
Yes, that would tend to suggest you may want to go and get your head checked. But he has worn his hair like that for some time, so there is. Anyway,
this is a rugby podcast, not a football podcast.
This is not football, Cammy.
Who are we talking about? This is a rugby game. I thought you said Arsenal.
Yeah, I know.
We're talking about concussion in sport. It's
we are.
pan sport.
Well, there we go. This is where rugby can put their hand up and go, we're better than football. And
we are.
Everybody can enjoy that. The
one interesting thing about the concussion test is whether or not it adds an element of kind of independence as opposed to the assessments that we see France, and even to a certain extent the way that some of the Lions players were handled in the last tour. Like Dan Biggar didn't have a full 10 minutes out for his test when Finn Russell was on. There's all sorts of stuff goes on, and whether or not these tests then mean there's an independent verification. You've got an official or someone on the sideline who says, that the concussion test showing that he's got a possible concussion, you need to take him off.
It's absolute madness that it's not independent. We've gotten full circle here, back to the start, but it's mental that it's not independent. It should be independent. Yeah.
And on that note, I think we've rambled on for long enough, especially when you've got that together. That's 2.5 hours of podcast this week.
Can't say we don't
give them exactly. Yeah, get your £3, hand them over.
Yeah. So you can, if you want more of this, you can sign up for our Patreon for £3 a month. patreon.com/Scottish Rugby Podcast. We've had a few £5 patrons. I forgot to say we've had 2 £5 patrons, and I'm getting to the end of the podcast, but I might as well give them a shout out now. So thank you very much to Gavin Brocky, who's a £5 patron, and Richard Sylvester, who's come in with €6. So guys, I don't know what the current exchange rate is at the minute with Brexit coming up. I'm going to assume that's around a £5. It's definitely not £3.
£2.10.
Probably, yeah, it's about 50p.
Did that not happen last week as well? And it was like £5.40. It was £5.40 last time somebody paid €6 because I looked it up. Yes, and we'll say mind and put them on at the start next week as well because they've probably got bored by now.
I know. I'll tell.
What's my sister commenting?
So Jonah Leon says, "Is this your sister?"
This is my sister. Yeah, hi Jodie.
If you thank your mum for picking you up from school after a bad hit, you know you have a concussion. Is there a story here, John?
I mean, I don't remember it if there is, so probably.
You did have concussion.
I think I might have done actually.
There we go. So we family members are welcome to join in with the chat. We're happy for anybody. But I've got the comms, as they say, or the con. I've got the con. Is that what they say? I can stick anything up. So that's it for this week. I will mention those guys again. She says, Jonah. She says, "Have put one out."
I know. Hi.
She says, "Hi, John." So yes, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in and bearing with us this week. Hopefully, you've enjoyed this podcast. We'll be back next week to cover the Ireland game. We've got Scotland's hardest player. We will do that this month. Don't worry, it's December now. We're going to do Scotland's hardest player. We've had a couple of last minute entries, so it's worth holding off because these are crackers.
Yeah.
The last couple of entries we've had, so we're really looking forward to doing that. So if you're on the Patreon page, watch. I'm going to try and get the poll up this weekend, so you can have a wee vote for some of the players there. Don't forget, check out the blog, scottishrugbyblog.co.uk. Sign up, do some reviews for us on Apple. That would be greatly appreciated if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts. But for the moment, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from John and Ian.
Cheerio.